Welcome back to the deep dive. You've sent us a stack of source material so dense we needed a Hextech coil just to power the processor, and it all revolves around one of the most acclaimed animated epics of the last decade, Arcane.
It's a huge topic, and we're not just summarizing the plot here. What we have is a detailed, critical autopsy of the show's entire narrative structure, its character psychology, and the reception across both season 1 and the very recently concluded. The sources are incredibly sharp in their analysis.
That's right. Our mission today is to distill the most compelling, most nuanced insights for you, our listeners. We're going to be looking specifically at how the show built its world, that volatile relationship between Piltover and Zaun, and critically, we're going to compare the near-perfect storytelling efficiency of Season 1 with the dramatic and often highly criticized narrative shifts and structural issues that plagued Season 2.
Yeah, Season 1 really set an impossible benchmark. I mean, it didn't just tell a good story, it presented this profoundly mature, psychologically nuanced narrative that was driven entirely by the complex and often messy flaws of its characters.
Right.
It demanded that you, as the audience, engage and think critically about these big concepts like progress, power, and the devastating cost of revolution.
And crucially, as the sources really emphasize, Season 1 was just a masterclass in subtext. It made you watch closely, you had to fill in the emotional blanks yourself, and I think that investment is why the critique of Season 2 is so intense.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack the blueprint of Season 1, because understanding its architecture is really the only way to diagnose the structural problems that came later.
For sure. When you look at the structure of Season 1, it was just engineered with this incredible precision. It followed a textbook, almost classical 3-act structure, but with a very clever twist.
And what was that twist?
Well, each 3-episode segment, so, episodes 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 9, they all function as their own distinct mini-narrative arc. Each had a clear beginning, middle, and usually a devastating end.
I see.
And yet, all 3 of those arcs seamlessly linked to and accelerated the larger city-spanning catastrophe. It was just brilliant.
So Act 1, episodes 1 through 3 is really that foundational tragedy. This is where we get introduced to the core political tension, right? Anchored by Vander and Grayson's uneasy partnership, trying to keep this fragile peace.
And where we meet Vi and Powder, of course.
Yes, and the crucial catalyst isn't some big political event. It's a moment of scientific curiosity mixed with childhood desperation, the Arcane crystal heist.
And the sources praise this narrative efficiency so much. The heist itself is just a tragedy waiting to happen. The children, especially Powder, are operating so far outside their depth.
They're just kids.
Exact. But the real emotional fallout, it doesn't begin when the crystal is stolen. It begins when Powder, so desperate to prove her worth to Vi and overcome this crippling anxiety about being the weak link
that Milo is constantly mocking her for.
Yes, exactly. She uses that arcane crystal in her experimental monkey bomb.
It's the ultimate unintended consequence. The explosion kills Milo and Clagger. It forces Vander to inject himself with raw shimmer, which is basically the chemical equivalent of a last desperate prayer just to save V.
And that all leads to his demise at the hands of Silco, who has just been waiting for this exact moment of vulnerability.
And those are the external triggers, the explosion, Vander's death, but the sources are clear that the real irreparable damage is emotional.
Oh, absolutely. The defining emotional moment of the entire series happens right there. V, consumed by her own rage and fear and just utter devastation. She turns on Powder and she calls her
And that one word confirms every single one of Powder's worst self-beliefs. It's just a cementing moment of betrayal, and it serves as the tragic climax of the entire first act.
And what the sources note is that it happened with breathtaking.
That's a strong claim. I mean, the pacing felt earned because of that slow burn psychological tension. But was there any consensus in the critiques about whether condensing all that trauma into one episode felt, too abrupt?
No, not at all. The consensus was that the pacing worked because the audience was never, ever lulled into complacency.
Okay.
The sources point out that even during the lighthearted adventures of the kids in the first 2 episodes, there's always this palpable cloud of dread just hanging over them.
And that dread comes from the grounded, intense scenes between Vander and Silco.
Precisely. They're constantly discussing the volatile geopolitical powder keg they're living on. So we knew the piece was unsustainable, which made the final rupture feel inevitable and therefore earned.
Which leads us to the power of contrast in episode 3, which the sources highlight as truly masterful. You have V in the undercity, fighting desperately for Vander, life or death, tragic struggle just defined by grime and desperation.
And then the script cuts back to Jayce and Viktor topside.
Right. And they're going on what the sources affectionately call silly science adventure.
Well, this contrast functioned as a kind of narrative misdirect. In Piltover, we see Jayce and Viktor achieve their breakthrough, right? They successfully harness the arcane into Hextech. It follows that standard heroic narrative formula: hard work, collaboration, a successful scientific victory.
So because the audience saw this formulaic success story play out,
The emotional devastation of Via and Powder's storyline simultaneously going so tragically wrong felt all the more visceral and shocked. The writers basically denied the audience the narrow victory they were conditioned to expect for the undercity orphans.
so why did this carefully structured storytelling feel so rich and efficient? I mean, it managed to juggle a massive ensemble cast and all these interlocking plot lines without ever feeling chaotic or overwhelming.
The secret lies in the constant intersection of the character. The writers made sure that every single internal psychological struggle mirrored the larger societal conflict of Zaun's burning desire for
So it's not just one big war.
No, it's a million personal betrayals layered over.
The critical review repeatedly stresses the characters rarely made annoying decisions driven by lazy plot contrivances or, simple miscommunication. And that is a crucial distinction that rewards you, the careful viewer.
Precisely. Characters made frustrating, sometimes heartbreaking decisions. They acted out of raw, irrational impulse, fear, arrogance, or self. But the sources note that these choices were always traceable back to established, well-lit characters.
So you felt a profound sense of tragedy, not frustration. You felt invested, never cheated by some arbitrary drama.
Exactly. I think the source's choice of the firelights interrupting Via and Jinx's reunion is the perfect example of. In almost any other show, that timing would be the definition of a contrived plot device.
Oh, for sure. Just designed to prevent them from talking.
Right. But here, it served only to reveal Jinx's pre-established, Silco-fueled paranoia, which was already driving a wedge between her and Vi. Caitlyn's presence only compounded Jinx's fear of betrayal.
So the external factor, the firelight, wasn't used to manufacture drama?
No, it was used to reveal true underlying character beliefs that were already simmering just beneath the surface. It was a catalyst for a psychological revelation.
And this psychological anchoring is why the foil relationships worked so effectively. Vi and Jinx, Vander and Silco, even Jayce and Viktor. These pairs weren't just opposing forces.
No, they were microcosms for the larger conflict between them. The destruction of Vi and Jinx's relationship symbolizes the death of hope for Zaunite independence, while Jayce and Viktor, they embody abstract concepts like the ethical boundaries of progress and power.
Even the relationship between Vander and Silco had that necessary ideological respect.
Absolutely. When they hash out their falling out, Vander is framed as the pragmatic hero, sure. But Silco is written with his own detailed set of principles. He sees himself as the true revolutionary hero, driven by a justified vengeance, not just some, generic, angry villain seeking power for its own sake. He believed in Zaun's independence more than his life.
So, okay, we've established the narrative and the character writing was near flawless. But the sources did point out one key area where the structure felt a little thin, and that was the political world building itself, outside of those intense characters.
That's exactly right. The core struggle is undeniably political Zaun versus Piltover, but the narrative makes this conscious choice to remain character. So while the basic world knowledge was sufficient to understand the premise Piltover is rich, Zaun eluded and poor, the deeper mechanics of the exploitation were often left.
I found this critique really fascinating because the show relies on economic inequality as the core dividing factor, the driving force behind the violence. But the specific economic connections and the structures of exploitation are ambiguous.
Right. We know about illegal Noxian wine and the pervasive, dangerous shimmer trafficking, but that's a black market economy.
So what's the critique suggesting? What could they have done better?
The critique points out that they could have fleshed out the system more deeply to really justify the systemic inequality that keeps Zaun down. For instance, we see very little of Piltover's official policies that actively repress Zaun.
We needed more concrete examples of that oppression.
Yes, like Piltover systematically blocking Zaunite patents or imposing exorbitant taxes and tariffs that choke out legitimate Zaunite businesses. That kind of visual detail would have amplified the gravity of the council's complaint.
And it leaves you, the audience, with some interesting unanswered questions about the social structure. Take Viktor and Skye. They're two individuals who grew up in Zaun, yet somehow they held positions of influence within Piltover's scientific elite.
Yeah, how did that happen? Was there a standardized, maybe even token scholarship system? Was it pure impossible?
Or was their rise to power exceptional, specifically because the system was engineered to prevent anyone else from doing the same? The mechanics of that social mobility were hazy.
And the sources argue that this ambiguity, while not fatal, it does dilute the political commentary. If the show wants us to be deeply invested in the possibility of prosperity and peace for both sides, we needed a better understanding of the systems Jayce and Mel were.
Their progress was being funded by some mechanism of exploitation that just remained visually or narratively abstract.
Exact. We needed to see more examples of the Council's corruption in action, beyond just vague reference, to fully grasp the true systemic gravity of their complacency. Their power was abstract, but Zaun's suffering was brutally concrete.
Okay, so the genius of Season 1 wasn't just what happened, but who made it happen and why. The writers expertly took these classic character archetypes and just put them through the trauma washing machine, revealing the psychological rot beneath the surface of heroism or villain. Let's start with Vi.
Vi starts as the picture of the heroic rebel. She's the ultimate authority figure for the kids, the unstoppable, fearless brawler who seems physically strong enough to back up her confidence. She has completed the tests of courage and established herself as the leader.
But the writers, they quickly chip away at that invincible image. She gets a critical lesson from Vander, which she tragically fails to heed. Leadership is about avoiding selfishness. What do the sources mean when they describe V's early attempts at protection as self?
That's a strong claim, I know, but the sources argue it's necessary for her character arc. V's strength makes her fundamentally arrogant and impulsive. She favors a toxic, protective big sister role because she likes the feeling of being the one who shoulders everyone's burdens.
So she's avoiding the vulnerability of asking for help.
Exactly. She avoids the vulnerable, necessary step of leveraging the collective strength of her community like Vander does when the whole bar stands up for Huck.
So her need to be the sole protector is an expression of selfishness because it prevents her from trusting anyone else, and ultimately it just isolates.
Precisely. She fundamentally hates feeling out of control, and this flaw drives the narrative disaster of Act 1. Her impulsive decision to turn herself in, which she had to know Vander wouldn't allow because it would expose them, that was an act of self-reliance that utterly backfired.
It forced Vander's hand and gave Silco the precise opportunity he was so desperately seeking to strike at the community's heart.
It's a compelling look at the psychological burden carried by that kind of heroic rebel, someone who enjoys taking on other people's problems in this mix of self-punishment and a profound need to be useful.
And her inability to let go of Powder later in the series stems entirely from this fear, a fear of acknowledging her own part in creating Jinx, and an even deeper fear of being utterly helpless to fix the problem she helped create.
That inability to confront reality leads directly to the tragic dynamic of the final confrontation in 1. When Jinx presents her twisted ultimatum kill Caitlyn, and Vi can have Powder back, Vi's answer isn't a definitive rejection of the premise.
Her response is flawed.
Deeply flawed. She offers to run away, just the two of them, stifling her own life, mistakenly believing that her constant presence as the sole protector would magically erase Jinx's issue. It is a nuanced, painful exploration of toxic codependency where love becomes a form of psychological.
And the journey from Powder to Jinx is, I think, the most mature and devastating depiction of the traumatized killer archetype in modern media. It's built on this foundation of profound accumulated psychology.
It truly is. Powder grew up with these overwhelming feelings of helplessness, neglect, and self-doubt. This trauma led to an unhealthy, almost absolute idolization. Her self-worth was entirely placed in V's approval, not in any intrinsic sense of self.
Which is why the sources highlight the crushing devastation of the moment when V tells her she's not ready. It just shatters this already fragile identity moments before the explosion.
The monkey bomb was Powder attempting to be the hero, trying to earn V's approval. When V returned and, in her own rage and grief, lashed out and called her,
she confirmed all of Powder's worst self-belief. The birth of Jinx is an emotional betrayal amplified by the chaos of arcane trauma.
And Jinx is such a complex figure because she's not merely a manic murderer, she's a carefully constructed coping mechanism. She protects Powder's remaining innocence by becoming the vessel for destruction, violence, and paranoia, everything Powder hates about her.
It provides her with a psychological separation from the unbearable guilt of that night.
Right. Her erratic, manic actions are rooted in a clear, albeit twisted internal logic driven by the constant, paralyzing fear of betrayal and an insatiable desire for unconditional acceptance.
So in the latter half of Season 1, Jinx is constantly torn between the two most powerful influences in her life. Vi, who represents unconditional forgiveness and a chance to go back to the past.
And Silco, who encourages her paranoia and her desire for vengeance.
And Vi's approach just backfires.
Because she fails to see Jinx as she is now. Vi wants Powder back, but Jinx knows she can never go back to being that helpless little girl.
And Silco, conversely, plays directly to Jinx's profound fear of abandonment.
Yes, he projects his own pain onto her and encourages her to embrace her bitterness. He understands her darkness because he views it as...
Let's look at the ultimate ideological foils then. Vander the former revolutionary, chose community building and nonviolence after seeing the cost of his failed uprising. Silco, his former partner, saw this restraint as weakness and profound betrayal, pursuing vengeance and Zaunite independence at any cost.
Silco is initially depicted as the cold, calculating Sigma male villain. Now, when we use that term, the sources aren't talking about internet memes.
Right.
They mean a character who is defined by his ruthless self-reliance, his absolute focus on ideology and control, and his commitment to his greater purpose over emotional ties.
So he's the classic revolutionary who feels powerless and therefore seeks total control through vengeance.
Exactly. His desire for control and his profound bitterness stem from that traumatic moment of betrayal in the river. But what adds incredible nuance in Season 1 is his utterly unexpected, irrational, protective bond with Jinx, the only thing that managed to crack his Sigma.
It's a strange bond, founded on shared betrayal and a mutual identity as monsters cast out by the...
And Silco used Jinx as a projection of his own hurt, guiding her to embrace her inner bitterness, which he found cathartic. And this bond ultimately led to the most human and yet most destructive decision of his life.
His love for Jinx was inherently self.
Completely. He didn't want her to heal. He wanted her to become him, a bitter, powerful figure who would validate his ideology. That's why he sacrificed the peace deal with Jayce, the independence of Zaun, just to protect her from V and Caitlyn.
And it creates this tragic parallel with Vander. Silco finally understood Vander's choice to value family above the cause, but because Silco's foundation was built on bitterness, his love was destructive.
By the end of Season 1, Jinx becomes Silco's bitterness incarnate, destroying their chance at independence and killing him in a blind, reactive rage, demonstrating how his own cynical, toxic worldview destroyed the very thing he most cared for.
Okay, moving to Piltover, we find Jayce, who begins as the naive inventor, the classic, good-hearted individual with a big dream. But the analysis points out his rapid descent into a political preacher.
Jayce's transformation is painful because it's so rooted in a common human flaw. His power and success amplify this core insecurity. He's driven by a deep need for affirmation and love, and a desire to achieve progress at all costs.
And this is why he constantly shifts his principles based on who he's talking. Mel for political might, Viktor for scientific advance.
And the sources argue he uses this people tendency as a way to dodge personal, ethical response. He allows influential figures to facilitate his natural shift from standing up for one belief to instantly going against it by the end of an episode, like being talked into firing Heimerdinger or raiding Silco's mind.
He requires that external validation, Mel's approval, Viktor's partnership, the council's praise. Without that affirmation, he lacks the conviction to adhere to a principle.
And this sets the stage for his major failings.
Viktor's arc, meanwhile, is described as the tragic exploration of the Nietzschean Overman concept. We should probably be clear about what that means for you, our listeners.
Certainly. The Nietzschean concept of the Overman refers to an individual who transcends traditional morality, who sheds conventional values and ethics to achieve a superior, evolved state of being for the greater.
Okay.
Viktor's worsening terminal diagnosis drove his intense utilitarian desire to leave a legacy. He felt he was an exceptional individual who was justified in crossing ethical boundaries for the glorious.
And this philosophy justified his embrace of unethical methodology, right? Like accepting Shimmer from Singed, using his own blood in Hextech experiments, and moving past the fear of volatile power.
Absolutely. He justified his actions by rationalizing that Jayce would understand, because they were both men of progress willing to break boundaries for the greater good. But the glorious evolution came at an immediate, devastating cost: accidental death of Scott, his closest confidant.
In that moment, Viktor realizes the true weight of Heimerdinger's warning.
Yeah, that this power is corrupting, and humanity specifically, he doesn't know how to prop. He's literally and figuratively tied to the Hex core. His legacy, for better or worse, is bound to this immense volatile power.
It's a remarkable piece of efficient character writing. His arc perfectly sets up the conflict for the next season, posing the question, what happens when a pragmatic scientist achieves the power of a god, but sacrifices his humanity along the way? The tension is immense.
And the character motivations are so clearly defined before the final curtain falls.
And now we transition into Season 2. After that explosive Season 1 finale, the expectations were enormous. The writers had to follow up on this complex web, establish tragedy and ideological conflict. But the sources are clear. The narrative approach immediately changed, and not for the better.
That's the core diagnosis. Season 2 immediately accelerates the pace, forcing major plot developments in quick succession, often sacrificing the essential psychological nuance and deep internal logic that defined the first season.
The story became less about character psychology driving events,
and more about events forcing characters into reaction.
So Act 1 is just pure, unadulterated escalation. Jinx's rocket attack kills several key counselors, including Cassandra and Balbach. In Piltover, Jayce rushes to save Viktor, who is gravely injured, by merging him with the Hex Core, essentially turning him into this desperate, fleshy genesis of the Hex Core god.
And Caitlyn's mother dies, which immediately fuels her vengeance arc.
And we see the immediate political consequence. Ambessa, Mel's mother, arrives, expertly manipulating the city's paranoia. She orchestrates a memorial attack that confirms her goal. Hextech weaponry for Nox. Caitlyn assumes the role of military dictator, leading the task force.
And we hit our first massive structural critique. Vi reluctantly joins as an enforcer.
And what's crucial here is that Vi's transition to becoming an enforcer, aligning herself with the very police force that murdered her parents and abused her, and her agreeing to gas Zaun, a gas that causes terminal illness.
Which is considered by the sources to be a clear betrayal of her principles.
Exactly, and it's handled almost entirely off-screen. It's justified in the script solely because Caitlyn asked her to, which demonstrates V's loss of agency very early on.
Then Act 2 begins with the controversial return of a major figure. Vander is revealed to be alive, transformed by Singed and Shimmer into the hulking monster Warwick.
Meanwhile, Jinx, now isolated and grieving Silco, unexpectedly bonds with the mute child Isha, and reunites with Vi to bring Vander to Viktor's new project, a Hex Core-powered communist utopia for Zaunites.
Which is a momentary, idyllic, and tonally very confusing.
This moment is critically described as jarring. The sources highlight the tonal shift, noting the uncomfortable juxtaposition of the wolf dad family hug in the middle of a season dedicated to the dehumanizing effect of war.
That idyllic commune scene is short-lived, thankfully.
It is. Jayce, transported to an alternate dimension by the vague anomaly, returns, visibly crazed and traumatized. He immediately blasts Viktor, killing him and everyone connected to his power in the commune.
And then Isha sacrifices herself to destroy Warwick, using Jinx's pistol, which had been modified by the Hex Core energy.
So Act 3 jumps back into the multiverse chaos. Echo is sent to a timeline where Hextech never existed and V died. Jayce lands in an apocalyptic wasteland. Mel unlocks her Black Rose magic.
While Viktor, having fully incubated, emerges as an evil god intent on enslaving humanity through a hive mind.
The finale is just impossibly packed. Jinx sacrifices herself to kill Warwick. Jayce sacrifices himself, embracing Viktor and jumping into the arcane dimension to destroy the Hex Core, ending the immediate threat.
The sheer volume of plot points, character turns, and cosmic stakes in this short window demanded a grounding that the season simply failed to provide.
Okay, let's hone in on the core diagnosis of the structural failure. The immediate feedback was critical, especially regarding the nature of conflict. Season 1 conflict was internal and psychological. Season 2 conflict was external and often contrived.
The central critique is captured by that exasperated question. Why don't the characters just talk? Too many critical situations arose for simple miscommunication or plot armor, rather than those deeply rooted internal characters.
Can you give us an example of that artificial preservation of conflict?
Savika. She was Silco's loyal second-in-command, focused entirely on achieving Zaunite. Jinx killed Silco. If Savika had learned this, she would have immediately handed Jinx over to Piltover, not out of loyalty to Piltover, but to achieve her primary goal.
Which the peace deal Jayce offered would have provided.
Exactly. The sources note that Savika, never learning this crucial piece of information, artificially preserves the Jinx-Savika dynamic and prevents a logical, immediate political war.
And the political maneuvers themselves felt illogical, too. Jayce and Mel, despite both recognizing the danger of war, they fail to vote against the invasion, which leads to the conflict.
Its character agency sacrificed for plot momentum. I mean, we knew Jayce was planning to resign. Why didn't the writers find a way for him to participate in a council meeting that would have allowed him to influence the crucial vote? These characters are often driven by plot circumstances rather than the other way around.
Meaning their established beliefs or goals stop mattering the moment the script needs a war to start.
Right. And then there's the jarring pacing. We lauded Season 1's time skip because it built directly off the foundation of Episode 3's tragedy. Season 2's skip between Act 1 and Act 2 is criticized for magically reversing core attributes.
How so?
Well, Vi, who is stubbornly active and fighting even while in prison, suddenly becomes a despondent drunkard. Jinx, the epitome of paranoia and self-hatred, is suddenly well-adjusted and non-paranoid, acting as a caring big sister.
This wasn't earned. It was just written into the time skip. It creates a profound disconnect for the audience.
We didn't see the internal work that led to this stability. We were just told it happened.
And we have to talk about the jarring tonal inconsistency. The sources highlight the chaotic shift. We're cutting between Echo's high school romance in an alternate dimension, a light coming-of-age story, and Jayce's eternal torment in an apocalyptic chasm.
Or the wolf dad family hug we mentioned before, interrupting a season that's supposed to be dedicated to the dehumanizing effect of a brutal war for survival. These shifts prevent the careful, sustained buildup of dread and emotional gravity that Season 1 mastered. They treat tone as a switch rather than an atmosphere.
So if Season 1's political world building was slightly thin, Season 2's is described as suffering a near collapse, primarily due to massive, unexplained political developments that reduce Zaun to an amorphous blob of unnamed resistance fighters.
The political illogicality is immense. Caitlyn, a low-ranking enforcer who had failed her primary mission of catching Jinx, is suddenly nominated by Ambessa, a foreign military leader, to be a military.
And Salo's most powerful council allies, who were characterized by their stubborn self-interest, agree without protest, despite their loyalty to the deceased council. It just strains credulity beyond the break.
And the sources point out that Sevika's success in uniting all these disparate Zaunite factions, the Chem Barons, the Firelights, the Jinxers, is completely unexpected. That should have been a compelling arc showing Sevika maneuvering to assume Silco's mantle of power.
Instead, we're just presented with a united front.
And the Jinx movement itself is nonsensical in content. Jinx's rocket attack was counterproductive and politically harmful to Zaun, as it led directly to the Piltover invasion. Yet, she is idle. The Jinxers' protests involve benign actions like smoke bombs, which feels sanitized and unbelievable for a city forged in violent, desperate...
It doesn't feel like a genuine grassroots movement. It feels like set dressing.
It does. And then there's the Hextech Arcane system itself. In Season 1, it had rules. It dealt with energy, light, and kinetic force. In Season 2, it shifts from being complex science to a nonsensical plot device, anchored by the frustratingly vague anomaly.
The anomaly is criticized because its rules are inconsistent and seem capable of doing whatever the plot demands at any given moment.
Right. It can transport people across dimensions, it can glitch Hextech, and ultimately it powers Viktor's mind. This violates the established constraints of Hextech energy, making it hard to be invested in the outcome because the scientific logic, the engine of the original conflict, is in...
This leads to what the sources called the Rick and Morty defense, where some viewers argue the audience just needs to be smarter and fill in the blanks themselves.
But the reality is that the story simply stopped providing the detailed internal logic and cause and effect that Season 1 so meticulously built. The characters in the world were now operating on arbitrary rules, which means the narrative tension becomes external. Will they stop the bomb? Rather than internal, will they reconcile their trauma?
This is the critical core of the critique, then. How are the brilliant, nuanced character deconstructions of Season 1 undermined in Season 2, stripping characters of their agency and creating this profound inconsistency? Let's start with V.
V's arc in S2 feels like a cruel contradiction of the core lessons she was supposed to have learned. One, she was meant to realize that her fists won't solve every problem and that she can't shoulder everyone's burdens alone. In S2, she loses agency entirely, being thrown around by Caitlyn and Jinx's plots rather than actively pursuing her own defiance.
The enforcer betrayal is an enormous structural issue. Her rapid acceptance of this role, gassing her own people, is handled off-screen and is a clear betrayal of her principles, justified solely by her relationship with Caitlyn.
And this choice, coupled with her subsequent actions, results in her being continually punished for trying to help. Act 1 chastises her for accepting. Powder has embraced Jinx. Act 2 chastises her for trying to save Vander. And the ending is criticized for framing her acceptance of Jinx's fate as necessary, as if her greatest flaw was simply caring too much.
So let's compare the toxic dynamics. In S1, the Jinx confrontation was tragic because both characters had agency driven by deep, self-destructive flaws. How did V's relationship with Caitlyn devolve in S2?
It devolved into an almost entirely one-sided dynamic where V, the notoriously stubborn and headstrong character, constantly acquiesced Caitlyn's burning vengeance arc. V stifles her own life to support the relationship.
And her critical moments, like arguing against Caitlyn risking Isha's life,
or punished by Caitlyn attacking her verbally, or worse, physically.
So V's moral compass is just a reflect.
Exactly. Vi only serves to reflect Caitlyn's moral stand. When Caitlyn is cruel, Vi is blamed for not believing Jinx could change. When Caitlyn softens, Vi forgives her instantly, even after serious betrayal. This makes the relationship feel like pointless suffering, rather than a nuanced exploration of partnership under impossible pressure.
So Vi's journey stops being about her own growth and becomes a diagnostic test for Caitlyn's conscience.
That's a great way to put it.
And Jinx was Season 1's shining star of complex characterization. In S2, her arc is criticized for being erratic, jumping wildly from suicidal apathy to well-adjusted sister and back to suicidal defeat, without the clear cause and effect structure that previously anchored her internal logic.
The critique specifically points to the rushed, unearned nature of her healing after meeting Isha. Isha is essentially a silent, sympathetic plot device designed only to move Jinx from one next.
So Isha is basically a plot device, not a character.
Pretty much. Isha immediately bonds with Jinx despite her instability, and the time skip suddenly presents them in a loving...
And this is where the comparison between Silco and Isha falls apart, right?
Absolutely. The narrative comparison between Silco Jinx and Jinx Isha is a damaging simplification. Silco and Jinx's bond was founded on shared betrayal and bitterness, where Silco encouraged destruction, he didn't heal. The show falsely compares this toxic love to Jinx's pure relationship with Isha, sipping over the complex internal work of Jinx.
And what would that internal work have looked like in the context of her established trauma?
Well, it would have meant Jinx having to confront her guilt over Silco's death, not just the trauma of Vander. It would mean acknowledging her own capacity for violence, rather than relying on Isha as a silent stand-in for Powder's innocence or Vi's approval.
The story skips confronting the dark. It offers a quick fix that is then abruptly taken away.
Which is why Isha's death is such a dramatic yet hollow catalyst. Jinx's complex healing is erased. Furthermore, her final act, the heroic sacrifice to kill Warwick, is undermined by the music playing, which suggests she views death as an escape from suffering.
Maybe death is like falling asleep.
Exactly. Despite finally having Vi's unconditional belief in her, it confuses the narrative meaning of her sacrifice. Is she choosing to protect the city or choosing to escape her?
Moving back to Piltover, Jayce's inconsistency is now his defining trait. He moves from vehemently opposing Hextech weapons to making them without a convincing transition, ignoring the wishes of Viktor and Mel.
His core flaw in S1 was being easily. In S2, he seems to act on this manic, arbitrary, crazed logic. The sudden pivot to weapon manufacturing feels contrived, lacking a powerful scene demonstrating why Mbessa or Caitlyn's arguments overcame his immense guilt over the child he accidentally killed in the mine.
His alternate dimension side quest, where he suffers in a chasm, replaces meaningful character growth with just basic emotional guilt.
Right. Suffering in a hole doesn't force him to make a difficult ethical choice. It just gives him guilt that he then uses as a facile justification for whatever the plot. He is a plot puppet, moved by external pressures rather than his own conviction.
And Viktor's descent into an evil god is rushed and poorly set up. His hex core evolution initially leads him to create a peaceful, empathetic commune, the Hex Jesus phase, which wildly contradicts the pragmatic extremism foreshadowed in S1.
He even refuses to use Warwick as a specimen, citing ethical reasons, something the utilitarian Viktor of S1 would have rationally considered for the greater good. This inconsistency makes his sudden decision to enslave humanity through a hive mind for peace completely unengaged.
It moves him from a complex ideological foe, a man tragically corrupted by his own good intentions, to a generic evil robot overlord.
Unengaging because his motivations shift based on whatever the plots.
And finally, the climactic conversation between them during the sacrifice. Jayce embraces Viktor before jumping into the arcane dimension, but the final exchange fails utterly to address their core ideological conflict, the misuse of power or Zaun's suffering, which was Viktor's original motivation.
Jayce's final message, "There is beauty in imperfections," is criticized as vague, Hallmark card, feel-good fluff. It fundamentally ignores Viktor's actual grounded motivation from S1, his desperation to cure his illness, to gain time to help Zaun, not because he felt inherently broken as a person.
The conversation avoids addressing the massive systemic failures of Piltover that contributed to Viktor's plight, instead implying his problems were internal and fixable with simple self-love. It's a deeply unsatisfying resolution to one of the show's most compelling ideological aims.
He really is.
Let's briefly touch on how the side characters fared under this rush struck. Vander Warwick.
The resurrection trope fatigue is real, and here it cheapened both and Jinx's years of suffering and Vander's previously meaningful death. Warwick is reduced entirely to a protect the NPC quest plot device, serving only to force the sisters together for the finale.
We miss out on any exploration of his consciousness trapped within the beast.
Yeah, a huge waste of potential for interesting character drama, all for the sake of spectacle.
And Caitlyn's vengeance arc is incredibly rushed and contradictory. She was supposed to be the nuanced bridge between the two cities.
Her character swings wildly. After the memorial attack, she moves from empathy to outright bigotry, calling Zaunites animals in the presence of V. This contradicts her established S1 characterization as someone who treats people as individuals regardless of class.
Her illogical decision-making, like asking V to be an enforcer or using the gray gas, wasn't supported by a thoughtful exploration of radicalization.
She becomes an agent of the plot's escalating cruelty, rather than a person making difficult understandings.
And what happened to Heimerdinger, the character who preached caution and suffered for his complacency in Season 1?
His arc is completely flubbed. He's initially reduced to comic relief, ignoring the very crises he predicted, making him appear detached and foolish. Then, his eventual self-sacrifice in the alternate dimension, powering the Z-Drive, feels arbitrary and rushed. It completely undermines his core struggle from Season 1, the need to become an active force for good rather than passively observing and failing.
His growth is essentially replaced by a convenient plot sacrifice. So if we look back at the entire journey of Arcane, the contrast between the two seasons couldn't be sharper. Season 1 succeeded because it used deep, well-established character flaws to drive high-stakes, nuanced conflict. Every single action had an understandable emotional and psychological root.
Season 2, however, struggled mightily with pacing, relying heavily on simple miscommunication, plot contrivances, and a loss of fundamental character. It often sacrificed that essential psychological depth, the core strength of the show for spectacle, delivering flashy explosions and dramatic plot jumps over sharp, earned character choreography.
The sources summed up the core problem perfect. Season 1 encouraged you to watch carefully, relying on subtext to reveal deep motivation and political mechanics. Season 2, due to its packed narrative and rushed nature, felt like a story you had to write rather than watch, forcing you to fill in the missing blanks of political logic and crucial character transition that the show failed to provide.
And we've witnessed the catastrophic failure of diplomacy through Mel, the failure of vengeance through Caitlyn and Ambessa, and the failure of extreme scientific progress through Viktor. Jinx survives the final battle, fleeing to pursue her dream of flying an airship, perhaps finally finding freedom from the cycles of betrayal and vengeance. V, meanwhile, is left standing in the ruins, having lost her father, her sister, and her friend, but refusing to back down.
Vi ends the story defiant, telling Caitlyn, "I'm the dirt under your nails cupcake. Nothing's going to clean."
She's committed to the fight, but given the sheer magnitude of the failure, the destruction of the council, the collapse of Hextech, the death of Zaun's peaceful commune, what principles remain viable for V's continued fight? And what must she finally learn to sacrifice? Or perhaps what must she finally learn to accept about her own limitations and the systemic rot of the cities to achieve any lasting meaning? That is the profound and difficult question. Deep dive.